This is America, and this is Huntsville, Alabama, known as America's Rocket City. Historically, this place was known as a center for rocket development, helping NASA with missions to the moon. But increasingly, it's become a powerhouse for the US defense industry. With more money being spent on weaponry, you can't underestimate the impact on places like this. I'll have more on that in a minute, but first let's head to our Washington, D.C. studio and Cyril Vanier.
Richard Gaisford, thank you very much. Earlier this week, we started the show with the idea that in the U.S.'s war against Iran, no one has yet won or lost. And that is true on the battlefield. But from a money standpoint, financially, the opposite is true. Some businesses have already won big, the U.S. defense industry, American oil and gas, while American consumers have so far lost out. Today, we look at the business of war and whether it shapes wartime decisions. So Al Jazeera's Manuel Rapallo is on Capitol Hill, where Congress will be considering a record increase in military spending. And Rosalind Jordan is with us in the studio to discuss the influence, Ros, that the defense industry has or doesn't have on policymaking. That's coming up in a little bit. So war has very real implications for those who are in the firing line. And the reality is that with every military move, some companies are making money. It's no secret that the defense industry profits. That's their business model. As conflict depletes America's weapon supplies, money needs to be spent to make more. And those missiles or planes or ships, they don't come cheap. Providers of autonomous systems, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence systems go hand in hand with defense as the nature of conflict evolves to include advanced technologies. And while some energy supplies are hurting because their oil cannot get out of the Strait of Hormuz, American producers are making money hand over fist. U.S. exports of crude oil just hit a record high last week. Also, times of global uncertainty typically see a rush to buy up safe haven assets like precious metals and government bonds. Well, gold has seen quite a bit of volatility, but at the end of the day, it is up 40% over the last year. These are all things that the president likely has to factor into his decisions. And Donald Trump is bullish about this war, about the economy, and about his ability to sustain hostilities indefinitely.
Number one, buy oil from the United States of America. We have plenty. We have so much. We've never had so much ammunition. Our ships are loaded. I call them locked and loaded. They're locked and loaded. They're ready to go. We have much higher quality equipment than we did when we first started the war. But frankly, I thought the oil prices would go up more, and I thought the stock market would go down more. Hasn't been nearly as severe as I thought. I think they have confidence in maybe the American president.
Now, defense industry spend-ups have been something of a gift for towns and cities where contractors are based. But is there a danger, perhaps, of over-relying on these war dividends? Richard Gaisford is in Alabama to find out.
This is a key part of America's defense industrial base. It might not look much as you drive around Huntsville, but billions of dollars have been invested here by some of the biggest defense contractors in the US. Technology developed in Alabama is playing a key role in the conflict in the Middle East. And the companies making it in what's known as Rocket City are bringing highly paid jobs that boost the economy.
We do see a lot of them coming in from cities like Washington, D.C., Colorado, a lot of different places. So there's a lot of growth that the defense industry is bringing here, certainly, and continues to. It's been wonderful for our business. Real estate, we rely on the people moving here, people, changing jobs, changing homes, upgrading, downgrading.
The Defense Secretary wants to increase military spending by 40% next year.
We're rebuilding a military that the American people can be proud of. One that instills nothing less than unrelenting fear in our adversaries and the utmost confidence in our allies. We fight to win in every scenario.
But the City Council doesn't want to rely just on money from the defense industry.
My goal really is, in terms of growing a diverse economy, making sure that it supports a wide variety of income opportunities. When we talk about long-range planning, we're thinking 1 year, 5 year, 10 years, 20 years in advance.
Space and defense, though, is ingrained here in the economy. This calm and quaint Alabama city, a beneficiary of global instability. Richard Gaisford, Al Jazeera, Huntsville, Alabama.
It's worth noting that right now the Trump administration is pushing for the United States' biggest ever military budget, $1.5 trillion. That is what the president wants the U.S. to spend on defense next year. A 42% increase, as you heard Richard report a second ago, 42% compared to the U.S.'s current defense budget. His administration describes the request as a, quote, generational investment that would unleash the American arsenal of freedom. So Al Jazeera's Manuel Rapalo is on Capitol Hill for more on this. Manny, the president doesn't actually approve the budget. Congress does that. The administration is asking for a huge amount of military spending. Is Congress likely to approve that?
Cyril, defense spending is actually one of the few areas where bipartisan support still exists here in Washington, but that doesn't mean that President Trump is not going to face pushback, specifically when it comes to how this money is going to be spent. I want to zero in on some of those numbers that we've been hearing for our viewers since this show began. The United States already spends almost $1 trillion annually on matters of national defense, representing somewhere around 4% of GDP. And as you mentioned already, that budget that President Trump wants, $1.5 trillion to build what he, in his own words, has referred to as his quote-unquote dream military for fiscal year 2027, doesn't even take into account the $200 billion that the Pentagon is asking for in supplemental funding to continue the ongoing military campaign in Iran. But the United States Congress, where we are right now, this Capitol Hill represents the biggest challenge that the Trump administration is going to face when it comes to securing that budget moving forward. Not because of partisan differences, but because of differences in how that money is being spent and where that money is going to go. A large bulk of that money is going to be going to private defense contractors, and we know that there are many on Capitol Hill who want more oversight, not just of the Pentagon, but of defense contractors. Now, in all likelihood, the Trump administration will be securing at least some of that funding, but not before navigating a very divided Congress, particularly as it relates to these differences on how that money is being spent.
Al Jazeera's Manuel Rapalo from Capitol Hill. Thank you very much. Let's bring in Rosalind Jordan into this conversation. Rosalind, you've covered the Pentagon, the State Department, not to mention the White House under multiple U.S. presidents. You know this town better than most. Many of our viewers will listen to our opening statement on the fact that some rich and powerful companies are making more money when the U.S. goes to war. Those companies we know have access to the federal government, access to the White House, to the State Department. They have influence. The question is, do they influence U.S. policy, maybe even wartime decisions?
It would be controversial to say that these companies influence wartime decisions, but certainly they do have an integral impact on the shape of the U.S. military. They bring forward new ideas, new technologies, new ways of fighting war, and then spend a lot of time and a lot of money, $171 billion in 2024 alone, with more than 1,000 lobbyists here in Washington to convince the Pentagon and the administration in power to use these technologies, to build these technologies. And when you consider that some 1.1 million American workers work for some company that has a link to the military-industrial complex, as Dwight Eisenhower called it, back in 1961. That's a lot of people depending on this work, depending on these public tax dollars being spent on whether it's a missile, a ship, a fighter jet, even the components that build all of these things in the Pentagon's arsenal.
And we were just talking with Manuel about the budget that Donald Trump would like to see approved, $1.5 trillion. That's a lot more than the U.S. currently spends on its military, and it already spends a lot. The question being, does the U.S., I appreciate this is not an easy question to answer, does the U.S. need to spend that amount of money? Does it need to build up its military this much?
This comes down to a philosophy that this president has on dealing with the war. He sees global threats, not just from non-state actors such as Al-Qaeda and ISIL, but there's also been an ongoing debate here in Washington about what to do about North Korea, what to do about China, what to do about Russia, if anything. And so part of this military buildup is trying to respond to potential threats that could be coming from these countries and from non-state actors. Is it worth $1.5 trillion? Well, that's for Congress to decide.
Ralston Jordan, thank you very much for joining us in the studio today. So what kind of numbers are we talking about when it comes to industry profits and company performance? Alex Baird has been looking into the size and scope of corporate revenue.
Waging war is big business, and for some industries here, the war with Iran has been a moneymaker. The oil industry had been broadly in line with the S&P 500. That's the benchmark for America's biggest listed companies. And then the war began. That soaring line is the XLE stock market fund. That tracks America's biggest energy companies. Think ExxonMobil and Chevron. By the end of March, it hit a 52-week high. And today, while the S&P 500 is only up around 4.6% since the beginning of the year, that energy industry tracker is up more than 30%. What does that mean? Well, during the first month of the war, the world's biggest oil and gas companies are estimated to have made around $30 million in extra profit every hour. And how about LNG, natural gas, that big earner for the Gulf countries? Here, you're seeing the S&P 500 marker again, but now we've got that against two of the biggest American LNG exporters. Once the war began, their market performance, well, it speaks for itself. There's been a bit of a tumble since that peak, but the numbers are still pretty dramatic. Venture Global's stock price up more than 90% since January, that Gulf-sized hole in the LNG industry being plugged by US exporters, leading to record export volumes. And then there's the obvious when you think war, the defense industry. Let's look at the 5 biggest companies and how much they made in the first quarter of this year compared to last year. Lockheed Martin is the odd one out. They did sell more missiles and defense systems, but its profits fell because of other costs. Then there are the windfalls. RTX, earnings up 34%, more than $500 million more than last year. Northrop Grumman, the most impressive, up more than 80%. General Dynamics also having a good year for the bank balance. And then there's Boeing, its defense segment earning more than 50%. All of those numbers meaning something pretty simple. Billions of dollars in the pocket and a very healthy pay packet for many American companies.
With us now, Dan Grazier, Senior Fellow and Director of the National Security Reform Program at the Stimson Center, and Paolo von Schirach, President of the Global Policy Institute. Thank you very much, gentlemen, both of you, for being with us. The real basic question here, we've laid out that some companies in some sectors of the U.S. economy, they do well out of war. They do well when the U.S. president decides to pull the trigger. Namely, obviously, the defense industry, oil and gas in this particular war, but that is often the case, and some parts of the tech industry in particular. The big question is that a problem? Dan Grazier.
Cyril, thank you for having me. Yeah, I do believe it's a problem. You know, the United States has essentially been on a permanent war economy footing, a permanent war footing for 25 years since September 11th. And, you know, the war on terror drastically increased defense spending. And so a lot of companies in the United States and a lot of people just writ large in the national security establishment really got used to having high defense budgets. And it's not easy to off-ramp that now. And so the best way to increase, to keep defense spending high is to have another war. And so what we're seeing right now is we're seeing a lot of missiles and bombs being dropped, and those are going to have to be replaced. And that's a lucrative prospect for companies like Lockheed Martin and RTX.
Paolo von Schirach, to the same question, is it a problem that you have entire sectors of the U.S. economy that stand to benefit from going to war?
Well, I don't know that I would call it a problem. It's an incentive for them. And consider also this. The defense manufacturers have their plants spread around many states. which means they have political support because Senator so-and-so would say, hey, this company is in my state, we want to, or in my district, if it's a congressman, there are, I don't know how many employees. So there is a
and we just saw it with our correspondent in Huntsville, Alabama. It's one of the many cities whose economy relies almost exclusively on the defense industry.
However, if we put this in context, overall defense spending in the United States is now about 3% of GDP. In the good old days of the Cold War, it was 6%, 7%, even 9% at some point. In other words, as a percentage of national wealth, the resources that are devoted to defense in a broader sense are not what they used to be. In fact, they've been steadily declining, which led to how can I say, shrinking of the defense industrial base. And even though we have a defense budget which is close to $1 trillion, and the request by the administration is for a massive increase in the next fiscal year, well, that is significant. Oh my God, that's almost $1 trillion. Well, look at the stock valuation.
1.5 trillion.
Well,
is the budget that the administration wants. We don't know if they'll get it.
Yeah, the fact is this. Look at the stock valuation, say, of Apple or Meta or Google. Trillions of dollars. I mean, there are other sectors.
Are we comparing like with like?
Well, no, but I'm talking what counts more in America, the tech industry writ large or the defense industrial base. I don't want to diminish that there are, as we just said, powerful constituencies supporting defense spending and all that. But also, let's consider that the part of the defense budget that goes to procurement is, what is it? Maybe my colleague here knows better than I do. 20%, 25%. The rest, most of the money goes to operations, keeping this whole thing going. Most of the money goes to salaries. You have to pay an all-volunteer force, and you have to provide salaries that are reasonably competitive with the private sector if you want to recruit people to serve in the U.S. military. So definitely the defense sector is significant, but I wouldn't go as far as saying, oh, the defense sector wants war every other day, because that's the only way to prosper. I'm sure that they make money, absolutely, and they have an incentive in that sense, and that especially now, considering that we drew down the inventory of smart weapons, of missiles, of Patriots, of interceptors, etc., in a very, very large amount. We need to replace.
The question is not just in an devoid of context whether they make money or lose money. I think the question, and many viewers will be asking themselves that question, is whether that creates something you could almost describe as a nationwide conflict of interest between these powerful companies and then the political decisions that are made. And you know who's the first person who actually famously warned about this? This was 60 years ago. I think you know. U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower, 1961. The term military-industrial complex. He was the one who popularized it. He used it more than 60 years ago, and it was his last public address to the nation. He warned about the growing power of the defense industry. Listen to this.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
So, Dan Grazier, this was a U.S. president. Yes. More than half a century ago, saying careful what this could do maybe to your government and to political decisions.
Yes, and it's very profound that it was Dwight Eisenhower that said that too. He would know as well as anybody, because he was famously, the five-star general who, led American forces, or led all the Allied forces, in the war in Europe during World War II. He was absolutely correct, and if anything, it's actually gotten worse. I actually don't even use the military-industrial complex, that phrase, that phrasing anymore. I call it the national security establishment, because what Eisenhower warned about has metastasized, and it is now a permanent part of the American economy. And I would actually argue when when we pulled out of Afghanistan in August of 2021, there were plenty of defense industry CEOs who were complaining that their revenue streams were going to decrease.
20 years in Afghanistan.
Right, and they were going to have to readjust their business model. Now, they were thrown a lifeline just a couple of months later when Russia invaded Ukraine, and the United States started sending a whole bunch of weapons in support of the Ukrainians. And if you remember, when President Biden spoke in the Oval Office about this, the last thing that he said and this is in an Oval Office address, he was making the national security establishment argument in favor of that, because he said that all the money that was going to be allocated to support Ukraine was really going to be spent in the United States by our own defense industry.
By the way, you're a veteran.
Yes.
You were
Yes,
an
sir.
officer in the U.S. Marine Corps.
Correct.
You served in Iraq and Afghanistan, so you're not anti-U.S. military. Do you want the U.S. military to get the amount of money that Donald Trump is asking for?
I want the U.S. military to get the right amount of money to build an effective force. And that's not what's happening right now. The very fact that we're spending...
effective?
No, it's not. Because if you look, let's just take one example, the F-35 program. It's the most expensive weapons program in history, over $2 trillion over its expected lifespan. That's a failed program. It is the F-35 program, 25 years nearly after Lockheed Martin won the contract, the F-35 program has a 30% full mission capable rate. That's abysmal. That number should be 90% for an effective program. So we've spent hundreds of billions of dollars on that program already, and we don't have much to show for it. The F-35 has not been very effective in Iran. That's where we're talking about F-15s and A-10s. And that's going to continue to move forward as we keep spending these obscene amounts of money on the military, because the services make a lot of poor decisions. Imagine if you're a teenager, if you're going away for the weekend, and you just give your teenager a credit card and say, hey, you need to, buy whatever you need until we get back on Sunday. Your teenager is going to make a lot of really poor decisions. But if you just gave them $50 and said, this is all you get, then they're going to make much more prudent decisions. But ever since September 11th, when defense spending has been increased, the services has made a lot of really bad decisions. There's a lot of failed programs in the last 25 years. F-35, Littoral Combat Ship, the Army's Future Combat System. There's a whole bunch of things. And that is all born out of fiscal indiscipline.
I want to share with our viewers numbers on lobbying spending. The amount spent by interest groups to lobby the federal government has increased last year, really across every sector. But one of the highest areas of growth was the defense lobby, plus 20% relative to the previous year. That means organizations spent a combined $191 million to push policies favorable to weapons manufacturers. Now look at the energy and natural resources sector. It spent a combined $485 million. I'll say that number again. That's almost $500 million spent on supporting policies that serve the specific interests of oil and gas companies. So, Paolo von Schirach, when you see that $500 million, right, for lobbying from big oil, do you think that influences policy, number one? And does it influence policy in a way that makes war more likely?
Well, does it influence? Of course.
Yeah.
This is what companies spend money for. That's why they pay all these highly placed lobbyists to do their bidding and to make sure that their interests are protected in the decision-making process. And of course, the budget is the salient moment in which the administration has to choose its priorities and say, well, how much money do we want for this and for that? And so these numbers, people say, oh my God, but what's the biggest lobby in Washington? The defense industry's lobby? No, it's the American Association of Retired People, the pensioners. The AARP is the biggest lobby in America. That's a gargantuan force. So I'm not saying that because of that, then the lobbying by the defense industries or the energy companies doesn't count.
Well, because
there are competing interests. That's what I'm trying to say. Everybody is vying for attention, and everybody says, "Oh, there's a limited pot of federal dollars for next fiscal years. Me first, and everybody is fighting for a bigger share."
Yeah, except pensioners, if they're fighting for their interests, that doesn't trigger wars. Whereas you will understand that people will look at $500 million spent and think that creates a big incentive, right, for companies that benefit from war. We see that they're spending that amount of money to defend their interests, and their interests are tied to war.
But again, if we look at the politics, and we know that now we are in a very strange moment here, because let's remember, Mr. Trump became president saying no more wars, right? That was his on his flag. I'm enough of all these forever wars. America first, essentially some kind of a neo-isolationist position. We take care of our own interests, perhaps of the interest in our hemisphere, hence maybe interest in Greenland, whatever's. We'll see what happens to that. But not certainly we want to do another war in the Middle East. That was not certainly on the agenda of Mr. Trump as he ran for re-election. And millions of people who voted for him say, yes, America first, no more wars, etc. So there's a bit of a disconnect between the political success of this president and his entourage, and, as you point out, the interest of the defense industrial complex that wants, to push the notion of we are under threat, we need to do this, we need to do that, so please give us more money, more weapons, more this, more that. And I fully agree with Dan here. We're not buying the right stuff. The war in Ukraine, if we can get to that, shows us that the future warfare is entirely focused on different types of weapons that we aren't really focusing enough on in terms of how the dollars are spent.
We have less than a minute left. So real quick, and I appreciate this is not a real quick kind of answer. If there were one thing to fix about this system, what would it be?
Oh, the U.S. military needs to buy simpler weapons. We need to focus less on exquisite weapons like F-35s, and we need to focus on simpler designs for things that actually work in the field, in the hands of our service members.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen, to both of you. Dan Grazier, Senior Fellow and Director of the National Security Reform Program at the Stimson Center, and Paulo von Schirach, President of the Global Policy Institute. Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you very much.
That's all from the team here in Washington, and in a moment, we'll hand back to Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha. But first, back to Richard Gaisford with a look ahead to our next show.
Thanks, Cyril. On the next edition of This is America, Friday marks 60 days since Donald Trump informed Congress of military operations starting against Iran. That's twice as long as he first suggested it might well take. We'll look at what's been achieved and how long it can be sustained. That is 18:30 GMT, 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time here in the United States. For now, from Huntsville, Alabama, goodbye.